Hello, my name is Ryan Nixon, and this is my first video in a series on the subject of international politics. This channel is an adaptation of an undergraduate political science course that I taught called Introduction to International Politics. In this course, we discuss international relations theories such as realism, liberalism, constructivism, etc., and we apply these theories to real-world events to help explain the world around us a little bit better. Essentially, this video series is about the organization and management of human affairs. The image you see here is probably a few 100,000 Muslim pilgrims in Mecca. They are ascending Mount Arafah on one of the rites performed on the second day of Hajj. This is quite a remarkable event because it is usually extraordinarily well managed. Relative to the number of people here climbing a small mountain, very few people are injured each year. Each pilgrim obeys a set of written or unwritten rules that tend to result in a successful upwards and downwards climbing of the mountain. It's the rules, the prescriptions, that account for this success in safe practice. These are the theories of explanation. We're going to be doing the same thing in this lecture series. What accounts for behavior at the international level? The rules, the prescriptions. This video is made in April 2019, and if you're watching this a few years later, or maybe even longer, check to see if I've updated the series. As history marches on, so too must our theories. As weird stuff happens, our explanatory tools must adapt and evolve. But first, here's a little about me. As I stated, my name is Ryan Nixon. I received a bachelor's in political science in 2012, where I specialized in Middle East and Northern Africa, but also somewhat in West Africa. I finished my master's studies in 2014, focusing on international conflict and cooperation. I became very interested in protest movements, especially ones where people commit suicide to try to win the revolution. I titled my thesis, Human Torches, the Genesis of Self-Immolation in the Socio-Political Context. I finished my PhD in International Studies in 2019, focusing on conflict and cooperation, as well as computational modeling and simulation. During my doctoral work, I gravitated towards nuclear policy. My dissertation is titled The Messy Nuclear Landscape, using fuzzy cognitive mapping to explore plausible nuclear disarmament scenarios. It attempts to solve a multi-stakeholder problem using a computational modeling technique. Other than that, I play the drums in a blues rock band called Death House Blues, and I have a cat. Here's my cat. His name is Frankie. He's rather camera shy, and this is one of the few pictures of him awake, alert, and looking into the camera, and I thank my mother for taking this one for me. I mentioned I specialize in nuclear policy. Here's a picture of me in the center, the short guy, conducting a mock International Atomic Energy Agency complementary access inspection at Brookhaven National Laboratory in June 2018. This was part of their annual Nuclear Nonproliferation Safeguards and Security in the 21st Century course. Additionally, that summer, I won an internship with Brookhaven in their Nonproliferation National Security Department, where I was able to build a rather large chunk of my dissertation's model. Additionally, I once lived in Beirut, Lebanon. Here I am pictured in a communist-themed bar. And this was during the very beginning of the Arab Spring. The Lebanese government was relatively immune from the effects of the Arab Spring. There were a few protests here and there, but they didn't really catch fire like they did in Algeria, Tunisia, or Egypt. And this was before ISIS moved across the Iraqi border into Syria, and the fighting in Syria was limited to revolutionaries and Assad's loyalists. On the other hand, Lebanon suffered greatly due to its ability and willingness to absorb millions of refugees. Lebanon's population doubled in a very short period of time, and it was quite remarkable because the Lebanese handled it rather well. Huge countries in Europe who took in a small fraction of what Lebanon took in handled it much, much worse. And also due to my travels in and out of Lebanon, both the United States and the Lebanese security forces have detained me for various reasons, but both times my detentions were brief and I was let go after some basic administrative questions. So what is this video series about? In many senses, it's about Game of Thrones. Many science fiction, action, fantasy, and zombie movies, books, and TV series have storylines that could be explained using IR theory. Whether it is the balance of power through tenuous alliances, constrained behavior through social norms and views on honor, or deterrence through dragonfire annihilation, Game of Thrones is a pretty good example of IR theory in practice in fiction. It has it all. It has anarchy, a system of states, limited resources, and men who carry their nations into battle, and the women who must behave like men when they inherit their dead husbands' or dead sons' kingdoms. But mostly this video series is about attempting to objectively examine the world around us. It will be almost as if you are an alien hovering above the earth in your spaceship. You can look down and see that states are doing stuff. Maybe they're fighting a war, but you can't necessarily see anything in high fidelity. What happens in the White House might be fuzzy to you. So rather than understand the war perfectly, you can attempt to explain why states go to war in the first place. And you try to predict what will happen next. Our basic problem, complexity, mysteries of IR. How do we manage 7.5 billion people? Obviously, this is quite complex. There are infinite participants. We can birth an infinite number of new babies. There are potentially infinite causes in IR. What was the cause of World War I? Were there multiple causes? If those causes happen today, would there be World War III? And that brings us to another problem of management. There are potentially infinite outcomes. Did World War I have to happen? Did it have to end the way that it did based on its measurable attributes? Of course, we're talking about a lot more than just a single major war. We're talking about the entirety of human affairs at the macro level. This means there are deep mysteries. How can we explain all of these things going wrong? What about the things going right? If you're a student of political science, it's likely you chose this major because you want to make the world a better place. If so, you need these tools to help maximize the good in the world. And lastly, how can we explain the mysteries of things that don't seem to do anything at all? Things going wrong. From the human perspective, World War I was traumatizing. Upwards of 20 million dead, which is about 1% of the global population in 1915, and the war lasted about 4 years. To some degree, the war was preventable. So something went wrong. What was it? Pre-war decision makers were meticulous and deliberate in their actions and decisions, desperately trying to prevent a major war, but their decisions had highly unanticipated consequences. One author we'll be looking at later suggests that the war was inevitable. So these mysteries perplex us. This girl thankfully survived, but many like her perished, and many whole families perished. And tragic events like these are ongoing. What explains military actions that will predictably result in dead children? While no one could have foreseen this girl and her entire family perishing in this U.S. airstrike in Yemen in 2017, it was entirely predictable that innocent civilians would die in the airstrike. So what explains humanity's ability to eschew morality for some desired outcome? Of course, I make no judgments. That's literally not my job in this series. I'm merely here to present facts and theory, but it's a legitimate question if we base morality on well-being. On the other hand, sometimes things go very right. The New START treaty between the U.S. and Russia, which limited the number of strategic warheads both sides possessed, was a major victory for arms control advocates, the non-proliferation regime, and of course international diplomacy. The 2016 peace agreement between the FARC and the Colombian government, which won the Colombian president the Nobel Peace Prize, was a huge victory for cooperation, diplomacy, and peaceful conflict resolution. And perhaps the biggest thing that we've seen is the peaceful reunification of Germany in 1989 and the peaceful resolution of the Cold War, which rather than being peacefully resolved, could have resulted in the extinction of the human species through nuclear annihilation. And of course, things going great. Major wars have been on the decline since 1945, and when wars do break out, the number of dead are much lower, so you are fairly safe. You will probably not die in a war. What about business as usual? What about all the boring stuff? How can we explain politics being so boring, that politicians would rather nap through UN proceedings. How can we explain when nothing happens? That's really difficult, perhaps the most difficult part of being a political scientist. Generally, we measure variation of outcome, change of outcome, based on changing circumstances. But what if the circumstances don't vary and the outcomes don't vary? Is there some structural force holding everything together? What is that force? Then there's the greatest mystery of them all, the limits to our knowledge, our bounded rationality. What can we know? We assume to know each other, but I can't read your mind and you can't read mine. This will be a major theme in the video on realism. Your parents, spouse, or significant other probably know you better than anyone else, but they cannot know the real you. Instead, they interpret what is most likely to be true about you, but their interpretations are never perfect, and we can't even know ourselves. We contradict ourselves all the time. For example, I don't like chocolate. I never have, but I love chocolate soy milk. Therefore, I'm incorrect when I say that I don't like chocolate, even though it's a factual statement. In other words, I don't even know myself. Walt Whitman said it best in the 1890s when probably way before his time, when he wrote in Song of Myself, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." In the second part of today's video, we're looking at the question of management. We have one world, 5 to 6 civilizations depending on definitions, a couple dozen regions to study, about 200 states, thousands of ethnicities, hundreds of thousands of MNCs, millions of NGOs, 7.5 billion individuals, and about 75 trillion worth of dollars to work with. What are we managing? What actors matter? Do you matter? Probably not, unfortunately, at least in the grand scheme of IR. But are we important collectively? These are major questions in IR that are yet to be resolved. Additionally, the actors change and the rules they follow change all the time. 1648, the Peace of Westphalia, took place between a handful of European noblemen, princes, and popes. The rest of us just went along with whatever they decided. They set very specific rules that made the rest of us simply irrelevant. But 1989, the people like us negotiated the peaceful reunification of Germany. That is, the people simply decided that the Berlin Wall was fiction, and the East German military officers agreed. And they stood by and watched while the wall came tumbling down. In other words, between the 17th and 20th centuries, both the rules and the actors changed. This complicates our ability to explain and predict. Here's an example of the rules and the actors changing quite a lot over a brief period of time. Finally, in part 3, we're going to be thinking theoretically and examining the is-ought problem. This video series is not commentary. It's not opinion. Opinion is not necessary. It's not commentary because commentary is good for coming up with new ideas, but it can't prove them. So what matters? We observe something in international politics. What is this an example of? What explains it best? Realism, constructivism, liberalism, etc. The theories that we make will guide us in coming up with the answers. Opinion, on the other hand, will just get in the way. So we need to avoid it if we're going to think like political scientists. Our solution to the opinion commentary problem is to bring in theory. Theories are the relationships between cause and effect. They explain more or less, for example, the theory of gravity explains why objects of mass are attracted to one another. The theory of evolution by natural selection explains the diversity of species, and the germ theory of disease explains some of the causes of why people get sick. These theories are testable and falsifiable, and they predict. And we can reasonably conclude through theoretical lenses that if I drop my phone, it will fall and it might break. And that is what we are doing in this lecture series as political scientists. Finally, and this springs from the need to keep opinion out of political science, we need to constantly apply Hume's guillotine, or the is-ought problem. Hume was a Scottish philosopher. He was traveling around visiting different societies, and these societies each had different understandings of nature. They believed that different gods were the cause of the universe, floods, disasters, and good fortune. And from these statements about what is, i.e. some God exists, they then transition into statements about what ought to be. Hume says this is impossible in logic. The verb has changed dramatically from is to ought. To put this into perspective, recall the trolley car problem. The problem is a thought experiment. You see a trolley car coming down the tracks towards 5 tied up people on the track. You are within reach of a lever that can cause the trolley car to switch tracks and avoid killing the 5 people, but by doing so, you will cause another person to die because he is also tied up on the track. According to this thought experiment, you do not have enough time to move the people from the tracks. So you have 2 options. 1, allow the car to continue moving forward, thus allowing 5 people to die. And 2, you can pull the lever, saving 5 people, but causing the death of the 6th person. We can get into all of the ethical, opinions on this. We can even expand the problem. What if the 5 are all Nobel laureates and the other guy is a convicted pedophile? But we're not going to have that debate because the entire problem assumes that you have power, when in reality, you don't. In reality, you are one of the tied-up individuals, rather than being the person with the power to decide who lives and dies. In this situation, you have a clear bias towards believing that the man should pull the switch. You would rather someone else die than you. What I'm getting at is, in the real world, it's difficult to avoid interjecting our own values and biases into our interpretation of the world around us. And no one's asking you to do that outside of political science. Vote with your heart, join a cause, be political. But if you want to participate in the quest for human knowledge, you cannot look to your heart. You cannot have a cause, and you cannot be political, at least not when you are wearing your political science hat. Here is a real-world example. You've probably heard these statements before on your college campus while animal rights activists duke it out with hecklers. The first statement is humans are omnivores, therefore we should eat meat. This contrasts with killing animals is cruel, therefore we should not eat meat. These statements are in opposition to one another. How do we determine which of these statements is true and which is false? Hume would say that neither is true, but also neither one is false. Neither statement survives Hume's guillotine because neither one is making an is statement. These are subjective claims about how we should behave as human beings. The first statement makes a naturalistic fallacy. It implies that things in nature, i.e., omnivorous diets, are inherently good. But then we would have to also assume that cancer, being naturally occurring, is also good. And the second statement makes a moralistic fallacy. It implies that some measure of good must reflect what nature intends. But the truth is that nature makes no statements about good or bad. Nature doesn't care what I eat. It's I that cares, and I alone. Even some of the big names in political science can violate Hume's logic from time to time. In the 1980s, Kenneth Waltz noticed that the U.S. and the Soviet Union hadn't fought any major wars, and he attributed this to mutual assured destruction. The fact that both sides could completely destroy the other meant that neither side was willing to get into a war. He then posited that if all industrialized countries possessed nuclear weapons, no one would go to war. Therefore, he argued all industrialized countries should have nuclear weapons. And again, Waltz is neither wrong nor is he right about what should be, even if he is correct that we could end all war through nuclear proliferation. Finally, let's put this in less dramatic, less deadly terms. This one is always one that bothered me as a child when my dad made me cut the grass. This is statement is grass grows. But we incorrectly then pivot to the ought statement, therefore we should cut it. This doesn't make any sense. Even if we say grass grows and hides deadly snakes, therefore we should cut it, this incorrectly implies 2 things. One, that we care about being bitten. I'm sure most of us do, but it's not universal. And 2, that cutting grass is the preferred way to handle the deadly snake problem. I live in a medium-sized city. We don't have a snake problem, and I rather enjoy watching grass grow high enough that it comes to seed. In other words, there are multiple truths about grass length, at least grass length preference in my city. Now, I can be fined for not cutting my grass, and I subjectively prefer having money to having tall grass, so I play by the rules. But the city code itself is based on faulty logic. As a voter, I might support one grass bill over another, but as a political scientist, my only loyalty is to the fact that one, grass grows, and two, society has decided that it should be cut. But I make no value statements over the length of grass when I put on my political science hat. Again, this is very difficult, but try to leave your moral prescriptions at home. Keep them, don't abandon them, have a heart, but if you're going to be a political scientist, don't muddy the political science waters with opinion or commentary. We care about what is and less about what ought to be. And that brings us to the end of this video. In the upcoming videos, we're going to be setting the foundations for theories that are going to be coming later. Specifically, I'm going to be looking at these 5 pieces in literature. If you'd like to prep yourself, or maybe if you're a student of international politics looking for more background, feel free to check out these works. And I will see you next time.